everyone, my name's Harini. I'm just part of the ATAR Notes team, and I'm also part of the Cheesemart team. And I just want to say a very warm welcome to the economics lecture. So this is the Economics 3-4 Headstart lecture, where we're going to be going through the first few parts of 3-4 economics. So we'll really cover Unit 3, and then I'll also talk about some of the study strategies just so that you're aware of how to study economics, how to answer the different types of questions, and just how to put yourself in good stead for the year. Alright, so this lecture is brought to you by ATAR Notes. So we've been around since 2007, and we've been offering free resources for students just like you, so that you can have that extra support, have that extra resources that you can access to help you with your studies. And ever since 2015, we've also been offering free lectures just like this, so that you can come to the free lectures, you can try it out, see how it goes, and just get that extra support for your lectures as well. So there's a lot of free resources on the ATAR Notes website. So for example, if you go here to the ATAR Notes website to register, you can actually access heaps of free resources. So there'll be study notes, which you can actually download. So they're study notes created by our tutors, created by other students that have been shared around, and they're definitely resources that you can access. We also have lectures just like this that you are accessing. It's free, and you can also ask questions. So obviously, if you're watching the lecture now, you'll find that question box on the side, and you can actually ask questions during that lecture time. There's also online discussions. So this is where our tutors are often monitoring the chat. Our team is monitoring it, and they'll be able to answer any relevant questions as well. And you'll have a whole network of other students that you can speak to, you can discuss with. We also have a lot of videos online, so these are kind of like short videos. They'll help you revise, it'll help with your revision online. We also have a newsletter to help keep you up to date with everything that's going on in terms of VCE. Obviously, for those of you who are curious and interested, we also have an ATAR calculator where you can literally use this resource to calculate your ATAR. We also have articles on how you can study, how to manage your time, any strategies and tips that a lot of our high achieving students use, and then just a lot more stuff. So you just need to go to our website and register, and then you'll be able to access all these resources completely for free as well. Obviously, we also have paid resources. So for example, we've got ATAR Notes Plus, which we use to pretty much, it's like sort of your Netflix of VCE. So it's where you can just go register for it, and then you can access all these online resources such as textbooks, study guides, topic tests, and so on. Again, all of these stuff will just be linked below in the lecture video. So obviously, just click the link if you're interested. Okay, so let's just jump straight into the Eco lecture. Obviously, Eco 3-4, it's a huge topic. There's a lot of content involved, but it is really straightforward if you can create a really good study pattern that works for you. So before we actually jump into the content, I'll just introduce myself. So I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. So hi, my name's Harini. I graduated in 2020, and now that I think about it, it does seem like a while ago. And I'm currently studying Bachelor of Clinical Science and Doctor of Medicine, and this is at Flinders Uni in Adelaide. The subjects I did, so obviously I did VCE in year 12. And the subjects that I did were physics and methods, which I did 3-4 in year 11. So I did 3-4 physics and 3-4 methods in year 11. And then I did Spec Chem, Englang, and Eco 3-4 in year 12. And out of all these subjects, I really did find Eco very, very enjoyable. And I feel like even after all these years, it's just so practical and so applicable in my real life that I feel like I haven't really forgotten a lot of it. Whereas, let's say Spec, I feel like I've forgotten a lot. So I guess echo, it's such a good topic in terms of seeing it every day, seeing it in your everyday life. It just has so much practicality. Okay, so I'll just talk about today's topics and how this lecture is going to run. So today what we're going to do is we're going to cover some of the very key points from Unit 3. Obviously we only have 2 hours to do this Headstart. So I just want to make sure that I'm as concise but as direct as possible. So I want to make sure that I give you all the detail in the correct places, and I really want to emphasize the important parts of this lecture. So we're going to cover some very, very key points from Unit 3. And obviously, because of the limited time, we're trying to cover half a year of content in 2 hours. So I can't cover every single piece of content in detail, unfortunately. But at the same time, I really want to make sure that I explain the difficult things in an easy to understand way. But if you feel like there's still some parts you don't understand, or there's something you want to clarify, you can definitely do that. So you can actually just ask it in the chat, which is pretty close to a video, I believe. Okay, so after this lecture, you also have access to the slides, so you literally can download them and use them as you wish. So don't stress about having to copy every single thing down from the slides. I really encourage you to just copy the key points, take a note of the key points, that's all. And there are 2 content blocks, so I'll talk about those first. So first content block is mainly about microeconomics. So microeconomics is literally, as the name suggests, micro of economics. So it's literally looking at the small parts of economics. So like the specific industries, the specific, the very specific parts of economics, I guess. So we're going to talk about some key concepts, some basic terms. So scarcity being one of the most important concepts that pretty much underpins the whole of economics. We'll also talk about opportunity costs, trade-offs, and just how decisions are made. We'll talk about demand and supply. So demand and supply on the microeconomic level in this case. So this is like demand and supply, how they change, how they shift, how they expand or contract, depending on market conditions. We'll also talk about market failure. So first we'll talk about perfectly competitive markets and their properties. And then we'll also talk about market failure, where markets aren't able to allocate resources in a great way. And then we'll talk about how the government intervenes as well to correct market failure. And finally, we'll tie this all with living standards. So living standards, basically the standards of living in an economy, and I'll elaborate on how to define that properly a bit later on. The second content block is all about macroeconomics. So we've talked about microeconomics in content block 1. In the second one, we'll talk about macro. So macroeconomics is really about the big picture economics. So it's the economy as a whole. So we're going to be looking at the aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So demand as a whole, supply as a whole throughout the whole economy. We'll talk about the government goals as well. So what are the 3 goals of the government? What are they trying to achieve? We'll talk about some of the key skills you'll need to study for ECHO as well. So this is sort of unrelated to the macroeconomics topic, but it's more so about just making sure that you're on top of ECHO this whole year. So we'll talk about some key study skills, key strategies to answer different types of questions. And I'll also talk about study tips to just help you out in doing really well in ECHO. Okay, so let's get straight into it now. So what is ECHO? Many people say economics is study of money, right? But the truth is, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So it's not just about studying money, it's literally about studying decision making. So economics is literally a study of choices. So how are choices made? So if you thought that economics is about studying money, wipe that thought from your mind, we're starting afresh. So let's start off with scarcity, which is probably the underpinning concept of economics. Scarcity literally tells that we have a set amount of resources. So our resources that we have are limited. And then we have unlimited needs and wants in society. So every individual has their own needs and wants, and these are just boundless, so they keep on coming. Okay, so that's a problem, because if we have a limited amount of resources, it means that we're not able to satisfy all our needs and wants. So there, we need to make decisions on how we can maximize our satisfaction. So let's just break this down. So first of all, resources. When I talk about resources from now on, this whole lecture, when I say resources, I'm not talking about money, I'm talking about land, labor, capital. So land resources are stuff like natural resources, so stuff like trees, forests, just literally land, like the space. Labor is the work that people do. So for example, an example of a labor resource is like a worker. So someone working in a shop, that's an example of a labor resource. Finally, capital resources, that's more like the machinery, the equipment that's used in the production process. So for example, let's say I'm working on a farm producing apples. The land resources is obviously the land that the farm takes up. Next, so land resource, so like the soil, the land, and so on. The labor would be the farmers, so the people actually working there doing the work. Next, the capital resource could be like tractors, which are used to sort of harvest the apples and make sure that, they can be sold. So that's pretty much an example of the resources. I will also elaborate on them a bit later on. But yeah, that's a bit about resources. And now the needs and wants. So these needs and wants are unlimited. So that means that just because you satisfy one need or one want, it doesn't mean that all of them are satisfied. So they just keep coming. There's unlimited. It's not possible. It is impossible to satisfy every single need and want of every single person in society. So that's just not possible. That leads us to opportunity costs. So obviously, if we have limited resources but unlimited needs and wants, we are forced to make a decision on what we're going to use these resources for. So which needs and wants do we want to satisfy? Which are we going to forego? And that's pretty much where the decisions that we have to make. And this ties in with opportunity costs. So when you make a decision, you are sort of missing out on all the other stuff that you could have done with your resources. And that means opportunity cost. So opportunity cost is the value of the next best option. So every time we make a decision, we want to minimize our opportunity cost. So we want to make a decision that's so good that the opportunity cost or the value of the next best option is not as high as what you actually chose. Next, utility or satisfaction. So utility literally means how useful something is, and satisfaction is like how happy you are with the product. So if you make a decision, you really want to maximize the usefulness of that decision, and you want to maximize how happy you are with it. So for example, actually this is a good example here. So let's say I'm trying to choose from bubble tea. So this is like very, very small scale economics. So there's ATAR chart that I went to. I have $5 for these bubble teas. All of them are $5 each. I have $5 in my pocket, and I need to make a decision on where I'm going to spend my $5. Will I spend it on a mango tea with white pearls? Will I spend it on a passion fruit green tea? Will I spend it on a royal pearl milk tea? So that's my dilemma. Now I need to decide which am I going to buy. So obviously the one I'm going to buy is going to be the one that I value the most. So even though they're priced at $5, I might say my favorite tea is the mango tea with white pearls. So I actually might value that at $10 because that's how much it's worth to me. But I probably really don't like passion fruit green tea, and I might value that at $1. And then royal pearl milk tea, I'll just say that's $5 to me. So that's my value of the tea. That's the value I assign to these teas. So what flavor am I gonna buy? I'm gonna buy the one that's of highest value to me. So if I buy the mango tea with white pearls, that's my highest value tea. So that's what I'm gonna buy. If I buy passion fruit green tea, which is the lowest value tea for me, I'm probably not going to be very happy with my decision. So my utility and my satisfaction won't be very high with that. But with the mango tea, I will have high utility and high satisfaction. Now let's talk about the opportunity cost. So why is it a good decision to buy mango tea? Well, I value this tea at $10, but my next best tea is the royal pearl milk. So the pearl milk tea I value at $5. So the opportunity cost if I buy the mango tea is the $5 of the royal pearl milk tea. But if I decide to buy the passion fruit green tea, so the one I least value, so I don't value this at all. So if I buy this one, then my opportunity cost is actually $10, which I value for mango tea. So that's the value I assign for the mango tea. So you can see that if I buy the passion fruit green tea, my opportunity cost is really, really high. So that means that the decision I made wasn't as good as maybe buying something where my opportunity cost is lower. So I hope that sort of summarizes opportunity cost and sort of helps make sense of it. Okay, so now let's move on to PPF or PPC. So PPF or PPC, that's a production possibility frontier or curve. You can call it whatever you want. It's referred to either way. But the purpose of this is just to give you an idea of a nation's productive capacity. So first of all, there's a few assumptions we make when we talk about the PPF or PPC. So first, we say that there's a fixed quantity of resources. So in the economy, at that point of time, there's a fixed quantity of resources. So there's a limited number of land, limited labor, limited capital. So it's fixed. This economy only produces two goods and services or two products. Again, it's a hypothetical situation. So we've got good A and good B, and it's only two things that are produced. There's no international trade. So this economy is not trading with anyone. It's just their own goods and services within their own little economy with their fixed resources, and they're only producing two things. So what the curve tells us is an economy's possible production in a single point of time. So it tells us about the productive capacity of the economy. And I've just noticed that there's a bit of an issue. So there's literally no curve on here. Okay, let's do this. Okay, so let's say this red part is the curve. Okay, this red line is the production possibility curve, so the PPC. It indicates the maximum possible production at a single point of time. So at the point X, which is intersecting with the curve, this point, we're on the curve. It means that we're producing to our maximum productive capacity. But point Y, that means that's inside the curve. So that means that we are producing less than our maximum productive capacity. So Y and Z. So we're producing less than that. We have spare capacity, we have spare land, spare labor, spare capital, and we're not producing to our maximum capacity. And finally, let's say we had a point here. So let's say we had point A here. let's say it's right here, at point A, it's outside the PPF. So it's actually not possible to produce at point A. So because it's outside the PPF, we can't produce outside our full capacity. So that's why we can't produce outside A. Okay, so now let's talk about markets. So perfectly competitive markets. This is again a really important concept in Eco. So first of all, what's a market? It's a place where buyers and sellers just come along, they meet to perform a transaction. So they exchange goods and services pretty much. So for example, Queen Victoria Market, obviously if you go to a bookshop, that's another type of market. And a perfectly competitive market is a very important structure that we learn for Unit 3 for Eco. So, are they in the study design? Obviously, you're going to have to look at that, but it's really important to know how a perfectly competitive market works and the properties of a perfectly competitive market. So, let's talk about that. So in a perfectly competitive market, there are many buyers and many sellers. So lots and lots of buyers, lots and lots of sellers. We assume that the buyers and sellers act rationally. So the aim of the buyers is to maximize their satisfaction. So maximize their happiness with the product that they purchase. And the aim of the sellers is to maximize their profit. So literally to make as much money as possible. And then finally, we assume that they have perfect market knowledge. So this is called full information. So this literally means that when a buyer and seller enter the market, they both have the same information and they're fully knowledgeable about the good that's being sold. So for example, in real life, if someone is selling you a car or a second-hand car, to be honest, you're not perfectly knowledgeable. They can lie to you about it being in good condition. They can lie to you about it never having an accident. But in a perfectly competitive market, both parties know exactly everything there is to know about the product. The products are homogeneous, so that literally means that they're identical. So there's nothing distinguishing the products except price. So when you step into the market, the only thing that's distinguishing each product is the price of the product. So for example, there's no advertising, there's no labeling and branding and all of that. Homogeneous literally means products are indistinguishable except for price. There's little to no barriers to entry and exit. So what that means is anyone can become a seller, anyone can become a buyer. There's no licenses or permits or costs associated with setting up. So it's no barriers to entry and exit. So what does this mean for our market? It means that, we want to make sure that we sell at the lowest prices possible and buy at the lowest prices possible. So sellers want to sell at a high price, buyers want to buy at a low price, and sellers are price takers because price is the only thing distinguishing the products. That's it. And one more thing, so there's little to no government intervention. So there's no taxes, there's no subsidies. It's just the market works by itself. So demand is a really important factor. So obviously there needs to be demand in a market for it to work. So the law of demand is a really important concept, and it really tells us how willing and able a consumer is to buy a type of product at a certain price. So as your price goes up, the quantity demanded also goes down. So it's inversely related. So this is the law of demand here, by the way. So these two sentences. So as the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down, which makes sense. So if something is being more expensive, you're going to be less willing to buy it. And as something becomes cheaper, you're going to be more willing to buy it. And that applies to pretty much everyone. And why does that happen? Well, there's quite a few effects. So first is the income effect. So as your price increases, people aren't able to afford it as much. So that's the income effect. So only the rich people would buy it as the price becomes too high. Perceived utility. So next, is it really worth that much? So like I said earlier with the bubble tea example, we assign a worth to each product that we're gonna buy. And we have to think about whether it's worth that much. So for example, let's say I assigned a value of $10 for the mango bubble tea earlier. If ATAR decided to price the mango bubble tea for $10, I would buy it. But if the pearl milk tea was $10, I probably won't. That's more than what I value it for. So that's perceived utility. So is it worth that much? So as the price increases, people start to wonder if it's really worth that much anymore. Next, diminishing marginal utility. So diminishing marginal utility is about whether you think it's still... So it's about how many you buy, for example. So for example, let's say we have ice creams on a summer day, right? If you eat one, you're really happy, you really enjoy it. But the more you eat, the less satisfaction you get from it. So the more you eat, you might start feeling sick, you might start feeling like you don't really like ice cream anymore. So that's pretty much the concept here. So diminishing marginal utility is the more you buy, the less satisfaction you start to get. So that's why even if price increases, you start to have less satisfaction. Substitution effect. So this is another important concept. So this, for example, this is basically when as the price of a product increases, you start to look for other substitutes. So for example, egg prices are getting really high, right? So what people might do is they might be like, well, egg prices are really high, but chicken prices are actually kind of low. So they might look for the substitutes instead. Okay, so now let's talk about the law of supply. Oh, I want to highlight one more thing. So this curve is downward sloping. So as the price increases, quantity demanded is really low. As the price decreases, quantity demanded is really high. Okay, next is supply. And supply is all about how willing and able suppliers are to supply a good or service at different prices. So this is the law of supply here. So as the price increases, the quantity supplied also increases, and as the price goes down, the quantity supplied also goes down. So it pretty much says that they are directly proportional. So a higher price means that suppliers want to produce more. And why is that? It's all about profits. So they want to make profits. So if prices are high, so if the selling price is high, there's a greater margin of profit. Whereas if the selling price is low, there's a lower margin of profit. Here is the supply curve. So it's upward sloping. So a low price means that there's a low quantity sold, and a high price means that there's a high quantity sold. Okay, so now let's discuss the markets and government intervention. So when we talk about a market, it's pretty much demand and supply working together. So here is an example of a great demand and supply curve. And this point labeled E here is called the equilibrium. So the equilibrium is literally the point where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded, and the market is, there's literally no shortage, no surplus. So shortage, too little produced, so demand is more than supply, and surplus is too much produced, demand less than supply. So we want to make sure demand and supply are equal. We'll talk about graphing and everything later on as well. So a little bit about demand and supply graphs. So shortages, if there is a shortage, it means that suppliers see an opportunity to get more money. So shortage usually means that prices go up. They can raise the price as well because of that shortage. If there's a surplus, suppliers want to get rid of the extra stock, so the extra stock that they have, and they actually just lower the price instead. Okay, so graphing. So we need to really be mindful of the difference between a movement in the demand and supply curve and a shift in the demand and supply curve. So a shift happens if something other than the price of that product changes. So this is called a microeconomic factor of demand or supply. So it's just a fancy word of saying it. So for example here, demand curve has shifted right, which means that at any given price, there is more demand. And we can say it's also increased or decreased. So here, here it's decreased. So demand has shifted left, meaning that there is less demand at any given price. Okay, let me go back. All right, so this is pretty much a summary of shifts and movements. Just remember, movements are because of price-related factors. So it's literally the price of that specific good or service changing, whereas shift is all about other non-price related factors. So this is an example of a SAC or exam question. So let's say there's strong economic activity through ATAR, and that results in more income. So if there are more incomes, remember, more incomes means that more people are able to afford ice cream. So demand shifts right. So at any given price of ice cream, more people are willing and able to buy it. Next, at the old equilibrium price, so you can see the dotted line extended, there is a shortage. So supply is here, demand is here, there's a shortage. So suppliers decide to raise their prices. So to up here, to P2, to counteract that shortage and make more profits. So this results in a new equilibrium at a greater price and a higher quantity sold. So that's pretty much what happens in the ice cream market. So this is another one to think about. So milk prices. Milk becomes cheaper. And how would that affect ice cream market? So remember, milk, you need milk to produce ice cream. So if milk is cheaper to buy, it probably is cheaper to make ice cream as well. Ooh. So that means, I should also draw the graph. That means supply shifts right here. Okay, at the old price, there is a surplus. So I should label this as supply 2. Okay, so there's a surplus at the old price. This means that because of the surplus, suppliers lower their prices to clear their stock. This results in a new quantity supplied. Oh, terrible writing here. And at a lower price. There we go. There we go. All right, so that's it. So that's how this would affect the ice cream market. So at the end of the day, there will be more ice cream sold, but at a lower price. Okay, so now let's talk about market failure. So market failure is all about how markets might not allocate resources in a way that maximizes society's living standards. So things don't always go to plan in a free market, and that gives us market failure. So this is pretty much when the market fails to allocate resources in a way that maximizes living standards. So simple as that, that is the definition of market failure. So there's quite a few market failures to think about. So externalities, public goods, common access resources, asymmetric info, and government failure. So let's start with externalities. So when we make a transaction, the person demanding the good or service and the supplier, they're not the only ones that are affected. So there can also be third parties, so people not involved in the transaction who are also affected by the transaction. So for example, let's talk about cigarettes and alcohol. Whoops. So when someone goes into the shop and they buy cigarettes, there's a transaction between the person buying those cigarettes and the person who's selling them. Okay, cool. But what there is, we don't really see as much, is there's also a cost on society when someone buys cigarettes. So for example, the person smoking, they're gonna affect the air around them. They're gonna affect the people near them because of passive smoking, the smell of cigarette smoke in the air and all of that. Maybe littering of like this the used cigarettes, so the cigarette butt, and so on. So those are negative externalities. So they are third-party costs of consuming or producing a certain good or service. So in the example of cigarettes, consuming cigarettes can lead to these third-party costs. Alcohol, similar example. So consuming alcohol can have third-party costs as well. For example, if people drink too much alcohol and they get extremely drunk, they can turn violent, they have less self-control, and so on. So that can actually put others in society at risk. So it's important to recognize the external costs. So it's not just the cost that someone pays when they buy that product, it's also the extra cost that society as a whole pays as a result of consuming or producing that product. So this is called the social cost. So social cost is the external social cost that people pay in addition to the private cost. So people don't often realize the social cost of their actions, and that results in overproduction of negative externalities. So here, when people consume cigarettes and alcohol, they don't really realize that the social cost is greater than the private cost, so the actual physical cost of the products. So this means that we're not at the socially optimal equilibrium. So this means that we're not maximizing society's living standards as a whole. Okay, so that's pretty much a little funny thing here. But let's do an example. So now let's talk about externalities in production. So there's a river, and the car factories are dumping toxic waste in there, and that's damaging crops, right? So that is actually a negative externality in production. So first of all, this car factory is not realizing the effect it's having on the crops in elasticity. So that's something to consider. So they're not considering the third-party cost. Another thing, toxic waste means that people might die. It's harmful to people to drink water contaminated with their toxic waste. So again, another negative effect. So those are just stuff that need to be considered. So for example, let's look at this. So there's a car market in scarcity, right? It's here. It's at equilibrium. But if people realize the social cost of consuming these cars from these car factories, the demand might actually be lower. There might actually be less cars produced in the end. So the problem with a free market is the failure to realize those social costs. So if we have the government of ATAR land, they might actually give a tax on car producers in scarcity just because they dump the water, they dump into the river. So this is government intervention. And this tax helps internalize the social cost. So it helps realize what the social cost is, and it really puts the price of that social cost. Another way the government could fix this issue, there's quite a few ways. So there's taxes one. Another one is just bans. So just like concrete bans on not producing here. They might put limits on how many cars they produce and so on. Okay, so common access resources. This is another type of externality. So one more externality I want to mention is positive externalities. So positive externalities are goods and services that have positive effects in production. So they have positive social effects. So for example, vaccination is one, education is one as well. So people often don't realize the social benefit. So for vaccination, when people get vaccinated, there's herd immunity. One person getting vaccinated means that less risk of disease for the whole society. So that's just an example. Okay, so now let's go to common access resources. So this is related to sustainability. And key points about common access resources. First, they're rivalrous, meaning that when one person consumes them, another person consuming them is impacted. And they're non-excludable. So just because one person is non-excludable means that you can't exclude anyone from consuming these goods or services. So market equilibrium, the quantity traded is too high. We're not at social equilibrium because these are often overused and they're not managed very well. So an example of a common access resource is like land resource. So for example, fishing, the fish in the ocean. That's a common access resource because one, it's rivalrous. So if I go fish and I overfish, it means that someone else fishing from that same ocean might have less access to fish. Next is non-excludable because, there's a huge ocean. It's not like someone can own it. It's not like someone can own it and say, well, you're not allowed to fish here, you can't fish here. So that's an example. How does the government react? They might put limits. So for example, in terms of fishing, they might say, well, you can't catch fish that are smaller than this size. You can't catch more than this many fish in one day. So putting those limits might help sustain those common access resources. Asymmetric info. So this is pretty much about both parties having perfect market knowledge, so perfect information. But in the real world, this is not always the case. So for example, perfect market knowledge in terms of like buying a car. So when you have a mechanic telling you what repairs you need on a car, you don't know if they're telling you the truth or if they're lying to you to just scam you. So this is where economic agents don't know as much as everyone else. Another example, global financial crises. So again, it's about mortgages, banks not knowing whether people can afford it or not. Okay, the way that governments can intervene, they can put taxes on stuff. So this is especially relevant to externalities. they can subsidize goods with positive externalities. There's quotas. So then, for example, overfishing. There might be like only a certain number of fish you can catch every day. Or for negative externalities, only a certain amount of these goods can be produced. Bans, so just being like total bans. So saying consumption of this good or service is illegal. So for example, illicit drugs are completely banned because of the negative externalities they pose to society. And other things they can do, obviously, permits, making sure that people get a permit, or creating a barrier to entry, so just making it more difficult for people to engage in a certain activity and so on. Okay, so let's say there is a subsidy. So let's say the government subsidizes a certain good or service. Oh, I should probably draw this then. I thought I already drew them. Okay, so government subsidizes. This makes it cheaper to produce that good, lowers production costs, makes suppliers more willing and able to supply. So supply too. Creates a surplus. Price is lowered, and then lower priced, higher quantity. So the purpose of this is to make these goods with positive externalities more accessible to society by making them lower price and a higher quantity sold. Quota. If there's a quota, if the government says there is a limit on how much you can supply, so if the government says, hey, there's a limit now on how much you can supply, that pretty much says that, well, you're not allowed to supply as much. So supply has to shift left at all given prices. So less supply at any given price because there's a quota. So suppliers just cannot produce as much. Shortage. So this leads to higher price sold at a lower quantity. So you're trying to reduce the production of that. And that's it. Okay, so living standards. These are this is a very, very important concept of 3-4 economics. So living standards is about how happy the people living in a certain economy are. So there's two types of living standards. So there's material, which, as the name suggests, these living standards are material, meaning that there's something that you can measure. So it's like access to goods and services, and they can be measured using stats such as like GDP per capita, so on like that. But the way that you define material living standards is the ability of households or individuals to access goods and services. Then we've got non-materials living standards. So non-material living standards are kind of hard to measure. They're very intangible. And they're more so about stuff like happiness, self-fulfillment, social satisfaction, and stuff like that. So it's really hard to get an indication of those just because they're so subjective, and it's just hard to measure in the first place. So an example of non-material living standards can be just safety, happiness, purpose, having that sense of purpose, and so on. So when we allocate resources in a market, we want to maximize living standards. So we talked about utility and everything earlier, but really the ultimate goal is to maximize living standards. Because if we can maximize utility and our satisfaction, then we can make sure that we're happy. Okay. Actually, I'll just highlight on that a little bit more before I jump into macroeconomics. So one more thing, so that's pretty much the purpose of a free market, and that's pretty much the purpose of government intervention as well. We want to make sure that we can maximize utility and minimize any social costs that come with production or consumption of goods and services. Okay, so now we're going into macroeconomics. So macroeconomics is like the big picture of economics. So it's the entire economy as a whole. So we're not looking at specific industries anymore. We're looking at the whole economy. So we're not going to take a break in this video. Obviously, the video is going to continue. But if you feel like you need a break, I'd encourage you to pause it now and have a bit of a walk around and come back. But I'll just go straight on. So macroeconomics, study of the large-scale economy, looking at aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and instead of just market-specific stuff. So, if you remember the circular flow model, amazing. If you didn't do 1, 2 echo, don't stress too much. It's very, very straightforward. So this is the old circular flow model. It just has 4 flows. So there's the household sector and the business sector. The first flow tells us that there are resources that are given to producers. So producers get resources from household sectors. So for example, land, labor, households can provide capital as well. And then in return for those, especially labor, there's income paid to households. So for example, wages, salaries, and so on. Okay, next, with that income, households go and buy things. So they buy things from businesses, and that's expenditure paid to sellers. Again, the business, in return for that expenditure, they go and produce goods and services. So they sell products to households. So it's like a sort of a cycle. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's just the flow of income, I guess, through this model in an economy. But there's one flaw with it, and that flaw is we don't know if households are actually going to spend all of their money to buy goods and services. So they're not going to, realistically, most households tend to save. They tend to pay off things. So they don't necessarily spend all of their income in buying goods and services. So that gives us this circular flow model. So this is what we're going to use in 3-4 Echo. So we've got the original one here, but flow 3, the last flow of consumption, is a bit different. So flow 3 has leakages and injection. So leakages are stuff that is not spent immediately back into the economy. Injections are stuff that is spent into the economy from other places. So let's look at examples. So savings. So that means that it's not money going into the economy. It's being saved. It's not going directly in. Taxes. So when people pay taxes, they have less to spend. So they don't spend all of it anymore. Imports. So if they buy overseas stuff, they're not going to spend as much on stuff in the local economy. Injection. So these are stuff bringing money into the economy. So investment is an injection. So for example, investing in Australian businesses, investing in capital, technology, and so on. Government spending, that's an injection, just because, let's say the government gives subsidies, it promotes spending in the economy. Exports, so if people overseas buy Australian goods and services, is money being injected, so extra money coming in. And this leads us to the aggregate demand equation. So AD equation, that's pretty much C plus I plus G plus X plus G plus X minus M. Sounds complicated, but it's actually very logical. So don't try to memorize this whole formula, just see where demand is coming from. So from the circular flow model, there's demand coming from consumption. That's this here. Investment, people investing. That's this here. Government demand, so government spending on stuff. That's this here. Exports, so people buying exports coming in here. Minus imports, so imports going out of the economy. So that's why the minus M comes into play here. So that leads us to aggregate demand. So aggregate demand looks very similar to just the microeconomics demand curve, The only difference is we're looking at the price level. So now we're not just looking at prices, we're looking at the price level. And then the quantity supplied is real GDP. It's still downward sloping. Okay, so aggregate supply, again, that tells us the total value of all the goods and services that all the producers in Australia are willing and able to supply. So as the so there's, I guess, two different ways we can look at aggregate supply. Usually it's given like this, the Keynesian one. So Keynesian, it's like as the prices go up, supply increases really quickly. Then there's like a slowdown, and then as prices go up, the quantity or real GDP doesn't increase as much anymore. The reason why it looks like this is because we're starting to reach our productive capacity. So then after a while, even if prices go up even further, we're not actually able to produce as much just because we're reaching productive capacity. So here we're under our, let's go back. Here we're under our productive capacity. So let me just use a pen. So we are below productive capacity. Here we are approaching productive capacity, and here we are very, very close to productive capacity. Okay, so this is a combination now. We've got aggregate demand and aggregate supply here. So aggregate supply is in this shape because of reasons I've already outlined earlier. Okay, so now we can see what factors affect aggregate supply and aggregate demand and how they affect the economy as a whole. So for example, if we have changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply, that's going to affect the growth in the economy. It's going to affect the prices of the economy. It's going to affect employment or the unemployment rate. So because we're looking at supply and demand as a whole, we're not looking at specific industries anymore. This is going to affect the entire economy. So economic growth, so growth in real GDP. Prices, so inflation, unemployment rates, and so on. So let's talk about what economic growth actually is. So economic growth is all about how real GDP is increasing over time. So are we increasing the amount that we're producing every year? So a great way to increase our economic growth is by shifting the demand curve or supply curve. And this way, the shift in both of them will improve our productive capacity. It will increase how much we produce and result in economic growth. Prices, so let's say demand goes up, prices will also go up just because of the same reason. So demand goes up, there's a shortage at the old equilibrium. This causes producers to increase the general level of prices, creating a new equilibrium at a higher price, and this literally means that there's inflation. Unemployment, so unemployment is all about spare capacity. So remember, aggregate supply, this vertical dotted line is our productive capacity, right? And until we get to our productive capacity, we are going to have spare capacity. So this unused capacity that we have is our unemployment. Okay, so now let's talk about the goals of the economy. So these are called the macroeconomic goals, and the purpose of these macroeconomic goals is the aim of the government to try to increase our living standards, and the way that they try to do this is by trying to achieve the economic goals. So first goal is the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth. So in this goal, what the economy is trying to do is they're trying to make sure that our real GDP grows sustainably. So it's growing first, so it's going strongly. There's an upward trend in real GDP. Secondly, it's sustainable. So despite the upward trend, We don't want it to increase to a significant level. Next is the goal of price stability. So the goal of price stability is all about how about keeping prices stable, pretty much. So this one relates to inflation. So here, this goal is all about keeping inflation in check. So we want inflation, but we don't want too much of it, just because we want to keep it stable. Otherwise, it's unsustainable. Next is the goal of full employment. So we're not trying to achieve no unemployment at all, but we're trying to achieve a rate of unemployment that's good for the economy, but not such a high rate of unemployment that it's bad for the economy. So we want sort of the sweet spots for each of them, and I'll discuss those in a bit. But these goals really, really important. So from Unit 3 to literally the end of the year, you're going to be focusing a lot on these economic goals. So how do we measure the price level in the economy? We use inflation to do that, and that refers to a goal of price stability. So definition of inflation, it's just a sustained increase in the average price level over time. So the way that we measure inflation, we use the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. And this is pretty much where the Australian, so the ABS, so the Australian Bureau of Statistics, they survey metropolitan households, so a very small percentage, I think just 2%, to sort of investigate what goods they buy, what goods they use the most, and then weigh them, and then determine inflation. Here we go. So it's a basket of consumer goods, and they're weighed according to their importance to the consumer. So remember, 2% of metropolitan household. So immediately we can see a problem there. If it's only 2% of households, it doesn't give us an indication of what rural households want. It's a very small proportion of the economy, so it might not always be right. Okay, so the goal of price stability. Usually I don't say memorize things in Echo, but if you were to memorize anything, memorize these 3 goals. So the goal of price stability is pretty much to achieve an inflation rate of 2 to 3% per annum, as measured by the CPI on average over time. So I'm just going to get this pen out, and I'm going to highlight the very important things I want you to say. So first of all, rate of 2 to 3% per annum. So per annum, 2 to 3%, measured by CPI. That's another important thing to add. And then this is really, really, really important. So remember, price stability is a sustained increase in price. It's not just a one-off spike in prices and they go down. It's like a sustained increase in prices on average over time. Why does the government want to do this? First of all, if the inflation is too high, if the prices are going way too quickly, we sort of stop becoming internationally competitive. So that means that our prices start to be really high and we don't sell as many exports anymore. So that's bad for our aggregate demand. Next, we want to make sure that our currency maintains its purchasing power. So again, related to international competitiveness, as people buy products from us, we have more purchasing power with that currency as well. So you'll talk a lot more about this a bit later on when we discuss trade and everything as well. Second, why don't we want zero inflation? It literally means that prices are low, they're not rising, and it sort of makes the economy look a bit weak as well, because usually a small amount of inflation is a good thing. It shows that we're growing, demand is strong in the economy as well. Okay. Next, let's do an example. So let's say the CPI is 100, and then in the next year it's 104. What is the final rate of inflation? Literally new minus old divided by old. That's it. So new is 104 minus old, 100 divided by old divided by 100. That's 4%. So the maths in Echo is pretty straightforward. How do we measure economic growth? So now this is our second goal of strong and sustainable economic growth. And the purpose of this goal is just to make sure that we've got a strong, sustained increase in real GDP every year. So we're growing with our real GDP. So remember, real GDP or GDP means gross domestic product, which is the total value of production in the economy. So for example, if we have 500 ice cream produced in 2018, GDP is 500. But we also just learned that prices are increasing over time. So our normal or our nominal GDP is not quite accurate. So as prices are increasing, we're going to get false indication of the GDP increasing, even if we actually don't produce more. So let's say in 2019, ATAR land produces 500 ice creams, but the price is actually $2 each. The GDP is going to be 1,000, so 500 times 2. But the amount of ice creams they produce is exactly the same. So to be honest, we haven't increased the amount we produce. We've just increased the value of what we produce. So that's where real GDP comes in. Real GDP is a measure of GDP where inflation, the effects of inflation is pretty much discounted. So we're not going to talk about how that's done, but just remember that real GDP gives us a better indication about the amount, the volume of production. So yeah, real GDP is the one that we really use. Okay, so the government's goal for strong and sustainable growth is to try to achieve a rate of 3 to 4% average growth in real GDP per annum on average over time. Okay, here I'm going to highlight the key things again. So growth rate of 3 to 4% in real GDP per annum. And then on average over time, you don't really need that for real GDP, but I'd include on average as well. Just to be safe, just to make sure I get all the marks. Why do we want to do this? So if we have a very high GDP, so within that goal, it means that we have more income, so more people employed, more access to goods and services, better material living standards. So obviously if we're producing more, we're hiring more people, there's more employment. More employment means that the incomes are higher and more people are able to afford different goods and services, so higher material living standard. We are close to our maximum productive capacity, so that keeps unemployment low. Why do we not want, let's say, 10% growth in real GDP? That usually results in very, very high inflation. So accelerates inflation. It's not sustainable. And we have limited capacity as well. So remember our productive capacity. We can't really fund that growth. We can't really achieve that growth with our limited productive capacity. So we want to make sure that the growth is strong, but we also want to make sure it's sustainable so that we can actually sustain that growth for a long period of time. So let's do an example. Let's say the real GDP was 500 in 2017 and it's 570 in 2018. What's the rate of growth? Again, new minus old divided by old. So that's 570 minus 500 divided by 500. So new minus old divided by old, that's 14% growth in real GDP. So too high. Next, last goal is all about the goal of full employment. So what does it mean? So the goal of full employment, the purpose of this is pretty much to be employed, you need to be first of legal working age, so 15 or older, do more than 1 hour of paid work per week. So again, the definition is pretty loose. So as long as you do 1 hour work every week and you're paid for it and you're over 15, you're considered employed. So this means that literally you don't have to work a lot to be fully employed. But that doesn't mean that everyone else who's not considered employed is unemployed. That's actually not the case. That's where it gets a bit confusing. Unemployed is not the same as not employed. It's completely different. So to be unemployed, we have a very clear definition. A person needs to be of legal working age, so at least 15. They should be willing and able to work. They need to be actively seeking employment. So there's like a number of minimum job interviews, job application they should be doing. And they should be working less than 1 hour a week or not working at all. So it's a very, very strict definition. So there's quite a few people who are not employed, but they're not classified as unemployed because they don't meet all the conditions of this. So why are people unemployed? There's quite a few reasons of unemployment. So I'll cover them one by one. So firstly, there's structural unemployment. So this is pretty much where people have skills, but they don't really match what employers want. So for example, if there is, for example, let's say the car industry, let's say you're an amazing car manufacturer, but there's really no car industry in Australia. So in Australia, you are very likely to be structurally unemployed just because your skills, they're amazing skills, but they're not really what is in demand in that economy at that time. Seasonal unemployment. So again, this is very straightforward. It's really dependent on the season. So seasonal unemployment refers to being unemployed because of what season we're in, or just because of seasonal changes. So an example of that is, let's say you're a mall center. So let's say you sit at a shopping center and you take pictures with kids dressed up as Santa. Now, that's really great. You're going to make amazing income during November, December, during Christmas time. But at all other parts of the year, people are going to give you weird looks, and no one's really going to hire you to be a mall Santa. Another example is, let's say, ski instructors. So obviously it only snows in winter. You really, like, if your skill is to be a ski instructor, there's really no demand for you in summer just because your job just doesn't exist in summer. Next is frictional unemployment. So this is pretty much for people who are sort of temporarily unemployed because they're shifting between jobs. The way that I like to remember frictional is shifting between jobs. If you move, there's friction, and if you're shifting, that means that you are frictionally unemployed. So that's an example. An example of that is, let's say you send in your notice for your job, you start working, and then 2 weeks later you're going to work at your new job. For those 2 weeks, you're frictionally unemployed. Next is hardcore unemployment. So this is for people who have, I guess, certain like characteristics or certain qualities that make it very hard for them to find a job. So an example of that is maybe a criminal history. So employers might be less willing to employ people with a criminal history, and they might be more likely to be hardcore unemployed. Another example is just, let's say you're an unpleasant person to work with. People might be less willing to work with you just because your personality is not great to work with. So yeah, that's hardcore unemployment. Lastly, it's cyclical unemployment. So the reason why it's in red is all of these blue ones are unrelated to the business cycle. So there's sort of stuff that happen regardless of how demand is in the economy or how supply is. But cyclical unemployment is unemployment that comes about only because of low levels of demand in the economy. So this is something we really want to avoid. We want to avoid cyclical unemployment just because it shows that the economy is not doing as strongly as it could be doing. So our goal for full employment, so the Australian goal for full employment is to get rid of cyclical unemployment and also achieve an unemployment rate of around 4 to 5%. So I know it says 5%, but it's actually 4 to 5%, as close as possible to NAIRU. So NAIRU is non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. It's a bit of a mouthful. But the meaning of that is just we want to get an unemployment where we're not having people earn so much that they're spending way too much and they're full on causing crazy inflation. So that's pretty much what NAIRU is. It's just a complicated way of saying that. So it's literally the lowest rate of unemployment we can have without running into excessive inflationary pressures. Okay, full employment can be confusing just because, especially with employment, there's like a very stringent definition. So not employed is not being unemployed is not the same as not being employed. So it's just something to realize. So a way that we can look at it is we have an entire population. Then we have a population over 15 who are of legal working age. Out of that, we have the labor force. So this is the population of over 15 who are both willing and able to work. So not everyone over 15 is willing and able to work, and not the entire population is over 15. Next, we have people who are willing and able to work who are now employed. So they work for a minimum of an hour every week and they're paid for that. So that's pretty much how employment works. So let's do an example. So let's say there are 1,000 people living in ATAR land, and 800 of them are over 15 years old, and 500 are employed, 100 are unemployed. The labor force is the number of people who are employed and unemployed. So that's 500 plus 100, which is 600. So it's not 800 because not everyone over 15 is willing and able to work. Participation rate, so that is the labor force divided by population over 15. So it's literally the proportion of the population over 15 that's willing and able to work. So 600 over 800, that's 75%. Unemployment rate, that's the number of unemployed people, so 100 divided by the total labor force. That is 16.7%. Okay, so that is pretty much the content for this lecture. I know that we went through it pretty quickly, didn't have way too much to cover, so that's really good. Now, I just have some advice to give to you in terms of doing this content and making sure that you're comfortable with it. So pretty much covered all the theory now. But now we just need to make sure that even if you know all this theory, you need to make sure that you can prove it. You need to prove that you know what you actually do know. So we need to really focus on writing an amazing answer. So writing answers in economics is pretty easy compared to writing them in English or some other subjects, because we're not trying to make it fancy. We want to make it short, concise, and really to the point. So a great way to do that is by using examples. So I'd really encourage you, especially when we talk about microeconomics, to use examples to illustrate your answer. Making a perfect graph. So we talked about how to draw those graphs, and that's really, really important for 3-4 Eco. So you're going to have questions where you're literally asked to draw a graph, and you need to be able to do that. So let's do an example. So some questions are super easy to answer. So for example, what is the consumer price index? Remember, it's just the weighted basket of goods and services that are most important to households. But There are also some questions that are worth more marks, and obviously you need to do some analysis for that. So you need to think about them and give a very well thought out, well structured answer. So for example, what's the impact of removing tariffs on the goal of full employment? So here, there's a lot of things to consider. First of all, what is the goal of full employment? You need to define it. What are tariffs? You need to define that. You need to link them. How is tariffs linked to employment? And then how is that employment linked to the goal of full employment? So we need to make all those links. So let's look at some sample answers. So first of all, this is our answer. So this is our first answer. Removing tariffs means that imports are cheaper. This would decrease employment since consumers will buy imports and workers won't have to make local products anymore. There's a few problems with this. So the problem here is, first, they haven't defined what full employment is. They haven't defined what the goal is. They haven't defined tariffs. They haven't explained how it will make imports cheaper. They haven't talked about how it links to employment, so it's a sudden jump. And so they're getting to the point, they're touching on the answer, but they're not really hitting it. Okay, let's look at the next part. So removing tariffs will decrease cost of production. So they've explained what effect. Decreased cost of production means more supply of imports and lower import prices. There we go. So that's where we're starting to get more logic and reasoning. So if there are lower import prices, consumers are more likely to demand imports and move away from their local products. So again, they've explained why the demand would change for imports. So since there's less demand for local products, there's less demand for labor. So decreased derived demand, just a fancy way of saying less demand as a result for labor. So because there's less demand for labor, this creates unemployment. The goal for full employment is to get an unemployment rate as close to Nauru of 5%. This would hinder the goal. So again, they've tied it very, very neatly with the goal. And they've explained what the goal is as well with Nauru. So that's a really good answer. And they're not waffling either. They're very concise in their answer. They're not writing heaps and heaps. Okay, another thing that's important, this is more relevant to Unit 4, but in the exam, you're pretty much expected to know important economic events from the past few years. So for you, it's going to be 2022 and 23, and it's important for questions and answers as well. So this is, again, relevant to Unit 4, but just make sure that you're looking out for what's happening in the economy, how the budget is going, and so on as well. Events, so an example, the cash rate. So the cash rate is just like the rate that the RBA sets. You'll find out more about this towards Unit 4. Towards the later part of Unit 3. So what happened to the cash rate? Recent economic issues. So currently a really big issue is inflation. So price stability, as far as I remember last, it was about 7%. So our goal of inflation, remember, was 2 to 3%, but our actual inflation in the economy at this time is 7%, which is way more than what we want. So just make sure you're aware of the social issues and how they're contributing to the economy. The budget is really important, so it's not released yet. I think it will be released in May of next year. So that's the one you'd be looking at. And then recent policies and whether they were successful or they failed. That's something to discuss, and just some general knowledge about the economy. So just making sure you're aware of what unemployment's looking like, what real GDP is looking like, and so on. This isn't an English, so you don't need to do this like you would do English subjects where you have to memorize quotes and everything. Just know the general stats, that's all. And this is really useful for questions where where it might be appropriate to give an example. So when the question asks you to give an example, it's a great idea to use the statistics and really demonstrate that you know exactly what you're talking about. If the question doesn't ask, you can literally do it anyway. There's no harm in giving an example. Obviously, just make sure you're not wasting your time. So you're not going to be marked down for using an example unless you've explained it incorrectly. But just be wise. Obviously, if it's a 1-mark question and it doesn't ask you to use an example, don't. Just make sure you do it wisely. And also, it doesn't have to be amazing. This is in English. We're not like the markers aren't going to look for fancy words and your ability to use some complicated vocab. Literally, just simple, straightforward answers. So what I find students do a lot at the start is they tend to waffle. They try to make their sentence really long and like elaborate and sophisticated. To be honest, you don't need to do that. You just want to make sure you're simple and you are to the point. So you're not getting marked for the fancy words you're using. You're literally just getting marked for being straightforward, answering the question, and showing your knowledge. Okay, so graphing, really important. So there's some things that you need to do. I'll use a highlighter to show that. So when you are graphing, big title, very important. Make sure you put a title in. Next, axis titles. So quantity, price, that's really important. Next thing I want you all to do, make sure you have demand 1, supply 1. Label the original curves, equilibrium 1, quantity 1, price 1. Okay, just make sure you're very, very clear on that. Next, I want you to make sure that you have the second part. So whatever shift is occurring, supply 2. Show the shift. Look at the arrow, it's showing what the shift is. Then what is happening to price? Show it. Equilibrium, quantity 2, price 2. These arrows. So make sure you're showing what's happening. And something that I want you to be aware of, so when you get a question with a graph and you're asked to explain it, just make sure you look at the legend. So here the quantity is boxes of oranges. So when you're answering the question, don't go, the market had 10 oranges sold. It's 10 boxes of oranges. So just make sure you're aware of that syntax. If you have an especially harsh marker, they might mark you down for that. Another thing, sometimes quantity and then in tiny print, it's like in thousands. So just make sure you're not saying 10 oranges. Make sure you say 10,000 oranges. You will definitely get marked down if you don't say it correctly. Okay, so now let's talk about how to study for Echo. So I'm not gonna lie, Echo is a very content heavy subject. It is tricky, there's a lot of things to learn, and it can be tricky to learn them. So we need to make sure that you know how to learn Echo. So just be consistent with it. So don't try to wait a few weeks before the exam, or don't wait until the week before a SAC to start prepping. Be consistent with it. So do practice questions consistently, do your notes consistently. It's much easier to do a little bit every day rather than a lot in one day. You're going to get a lot more value out of it. So every year, just make sure that you, throughout the year, not every year, just make sure that if you take notes, just summarize them. So that's something I really like to do. So at the end of every area of study, I like to just make a tiny cue card summarizing the whole information from the whole area of study. So this is where I had to make sure that I was picking out stuff that I was weak in, and I had to make sure that I was obviously making decisions on what to include on those cue cards. Important events. So this is going to start becoming important later in the year. So this is where you just need to make sure that you're aware of what's going on in the economy. Just have a list of like important things that's impacted the economy. And most important, just make sure you're practicing how to write exam style answers. So make sure you know how to write them, make sure you are writing them correctly, keeping them short, concise, and to the point. And remember, use your resources. So you have your teachers around you, get them to mark it. So just make sure that you use their help. Because obviously they want you to do well in Echo, and you want to do well in Echo too. In term 1 of next year, so when you start off 3-4 Echo, first thing I want you to get used to is the graphs. So Echo graphs are a little bit different to, let's say, maths graphs or all the other graphs you've done. So it's really important to get used to them, be comfortable with how to graph demand and supply, understand why demand is downward sloping but supply is upward sloping. So law of demand, law of supply. And then percentage change. So people often confuse themselves when it comes to percentage change. So I have a little slogan in my head that just goes new minus old divided by old. So every time I read percentage change in my head, I'm just like new minus old divided by old. Okay, study tips. Obviously, this is one of our Echo tutors who took these notes. So she's very, very organized. She did really well in Echo as well. But obviously everyone does it differently. So for some people, it works to take really pretty notes like that. It works to spend time to take notes. But for others, practice questions are what might work best. So just make sure, especially during the holidays, you find a study method that works for you. So first of all, whether you're a note-taking type of person or you're jump straight into practice questions type of person, just make sure that you know whether your method is working for you. And if it isn't, be flexible and try to change your method depending on whether it's working or not. So it's definitely understandable. Like, it's hard to learn stuff without knowing what you actually need to know. And that's where the study design comes about. So make sure you're using the study design as a checklist, because it's literally a very, very comprehensive checklist of everything that could possibly be in the exam. So just make sure that you use the study design to find out what you need to know and make sure you know it. Next, summarizing is really helpful. So if you're a type of person who likes having notes to review at the end of the day, summarize it. So that's what I did. So the way that I did summaries wasn't from the textbook, but I did heaps of practice questions. And then I found that I was making some very obvious mistakes, so very clear patterns of mistakes. And that's how I made cards. So there's some topics that I struggle with more than others, and that's where I made my cue cards. So I know the Echo textbook has summary components as well. So just make sure you look at the summary before a SAC, just to reassure yourself, and just make sure that you are aware of your resources. And then again, make sure you use your study design. So that's like your number one resource on what you need to cover. Lots and lots of resources out there. Just make sure that you're not just sitting around and reading your notes. You want to make sure that you are really actively learning. So reading your notes is just a passive technique. It's not really going to go into your mind as much. Whereas if you were to actually do questions, if you were to actively learn, that would actually help you a lot more and improve your retention. Again, don't just read stuff. It's really boring to read a textbook. So have a method for active recall, active memory. So either whether it's making flashcards, or if you make your own questions, or if you quiz your friends, it really helps. Something that might be helpful is maybe marking your friend's sacks. So if you do practice sacks together, you can literally have a friend group, a study group where you mark each other's sacks. And this way, you can sort of see the common mistakes people make and avoid them yourself. And you can tell your friends what mistakes not to make. And by teaching something to others, you really do remember it much better. Okay, some other study tips. Make sure you read the news to keep up to date with economics related events. Just have an idea of what's going on in the world. It's really important, so just be aware of like the political economic events. So for example, any conflicts, any trade wars and stuff like that. Any trade partnerships as well too. And just make sure that you have like a document to keep all these together. So just have all the stats, budget initiatives, all the events, just keep them in one place and you can just add to them through the year. So it's really important for the exam, and as you do it throughout the year, you really help yourself as well. So an example, have a Word doc with all the tables, Quizlet, shared page with your class. That's also a good idea too. Okay, so studying. So now the actual study process for Echo. So you want to make sure that you're working hard for Echo, but you also want to be efficient. So you don't want to spend 5 hours every day doing Echo, because obviously you have other priorities. You have other subjects to do, you have your own life that you also need to prioritize. So just make sure you're maximizing your efficiency. So make sure that it can be helpful to condense your notes, but don't spend hours and hours doing that. Just spend some time doing it. Use flashcards. That can really help with Echo. There's a lot of definition, so if you have troubles with definitions, I definitely recommend flashcards. Practice questions. So definitely do practice questions. This will really improve your responses to practice sacks. Something I'd say you avoid, don't do unnecessary amounts of questions. So don't do 50 questions asking you to define relative scarcity. So just make sure you're practicing all areas and you focus on your weakness while you study. Next, more study tips. So just be consistent with it. So don't just do lots and lots and lots of questions at once. Be consistent. Do many over many weeks. Don't do last minute study sessions. Try to make sure that you're consistent with it. And you have a lot of resources out there, so just make sure you use as many as possible, or not as many as possible, as many as you need and you feel would be useful. So there's a lot of stuff out there. So there's lots of places on YouTube that do like economics videos. You have your teachers and tutors. You have study notes. So whether you do that look at that on the ATAR Notes website, or whether your teachers provide those for you. Google, obviously, searching stuff up. Textbook questions. So you have textbooks. You can use that to do questions on there. You might have access to previous sacks, so that's where you'll get questions, and you can even write your own questions. So if you have a study group form, you can actually have a study group where everyone writes their question and you will have a go at answering it. And it sort of gives you, when you write your own question, you can sort of think about what you expect in your answer. So it really does help you in terms of writing an answer as well. Some more study tips, just make sure that your desk is organized. Make sure that everything is organized and everything is looking like something that you'd want to study. So pretty much make sure that you have a very distinct workspace. So when you're at home, make sure that you have a clear desk where you're just going to sit, study, and you don't relax there. That is exclusively your workspace. So that will get you in the mindset of studying every time you sit there. Next, make sure that you relax somewhere else. So obviously don't sit at your desk and study for 5 minutes and relax for another 10 minutes and so on. Have specific places where you work and where you relax, and that sort of splits up your working environment and your relaxing environment. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the lecture. I've spoken so much at you. I've thrown so much content at you so far. So I understand if you're feeling overwhelmed. I understand that a lot of you might need to process all this information that I've just barraged at you. So just a few things I want to say. Thank you so much for watching the lecture. I hope that you all have a lot of fun in Echo. It's a fun subject. It's really interesting. It's so practical. So just have fun with it. It is content heavy, but unlike a lot of other subjects, it's just so practical. Like when you read the news, so as you do Echo and you read the news, you're like, oh, I know this. I know exactly what they're talking about, right? So it's such a practical subject, and you can definitely have fun with it. But yeah, that's pretty much a summary of what we covered, what we need to do. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask any questions in the chat. Any comments at all, just make them in the chat. But thank you so much for coming today, and I hope you found this lecture very useful as well.